Well, welcome to another edition of AP's Profiles in Christian Living. My name is Mark Powell, and my special guest with me today is Dr. Mark Durie. Mark is an ordained Anglican minister in Australia and also now a part-time professor at Melbourne School of Theology, as well as working in various other ministries, but is, I think, one of Australia's leading experts on Islam and interfaith dialogue. Mark, welcome. It's great to have you with us.
It's great to be with you too, Mark.
So, Mark, I've given our listeners a brief introduction as to what you do, but could you please just expand on what your current ministry looks like at the moment?
Yes, well, for more than 20 years, I was in pastoral ministry in the Anglican Church in Melbourne. But from 2020 on, I've been writing and teaching and speaking on various issues that are of concern to the global church. Part of my time, I work for Melbourne School of Theology. I'm part of the Arthur Jeffrey Centre there, which teaches on Islamics for Christians who want to receive training about understanding Islam and the mission to the Muslim world. And the rest of my time, I'm employed by the Institute for Spiritual Awareness, which is a charity which basically supports me in my work. A major focus for me is discipleship of Muslim background believers, which is a really hot and important issue around the world today. So many Muslims are turning to Christ, and the biggest challenge is getting the harvest into the barn safely, helping people to be well established when they come to Christ. So that's a major area of concern for me. I'm also really interested in how faith is affecting our culture and how Christians can stay true to a Christian worldview in difficult and troubling times. And I think for 20 years, I've been really working on Islam to teaching, equipping the church. I felt called to equip the church, particularly to respond to the multiple challenges that Islam brings to us.
Yeah, Mark, you've written a
I
number.
have a website.
Sorry, you go.
I have a website, markdurie.com. That's Durie, markdurie.com. And people can find my blog posts, or if they wish, they can contribute to support my ministry too through that site.
Great. I mean, you've written a number of excellent books. I think one of my favourite books, actually, in the top 10 on any topic is this one, The Third Choice, explaining dimitude. But not only is, and I guess for our listeners, it's the third choice is either conversion, death, or effectively enslavement, paying a tax to an Islamic majority. But it's not just a great explanation of that whole section, but I think one of the clearest explanations of the Christian good news, or what we would call the gospel, that I've read. It's excellent. Mark, what first got you interested in this whole topic?
Well, many years ago, in a former life, you might say, I was doing a PhD in linguistics in Aceh in Indonesia on the language. I wrote a grammar of the language. And as part of my time there, I learned about Islam because Aceh is the most Islamicized part of Indonesia. And then when I was quite interested because it was interesting to watch look at the position of Christians living in that very Islamic context. And it was difficult for them. And those remembrances stayed with me, and stories of how Christians had suffered there. And then when 9/11 happened, I realized I knew instantly when I was watching the video there, not watching my TV late at night, and seeing those towers fall. I knew immediately who'd done it and why. And then why I was a bit shocked by that, because I realized that the culture around me, people around me in Australia, had no idea why anyone would do such a thing. And so that really triggered me to learn more and do more research, and also to teach and equip the church. And along the way, I've done a second doctorate in the theology of the Quran. And I've been writing and teaching ever since. So that was a pivotal moment for me, those events on 9/11.
Yeah, more recently, we've seen the attacks in Israel from Hamas. Do you think there's any parallels there between Al Qaeda and Hamas and their approach to what they would consider their enemies?
Yes, well, both those groups come out of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was a radical reform movement. to try and establish pure Islam and ultimately a caliphate, an Islamic kingdom, I suppose, around the world. And Al Qaeda and Hamas have a very similar ideology. They both object to the occupation of Muslim lands by non-Muslims, and they want to liberate those lands. Their methods, the things they would allow and believe in, are really virtually exactly the same. And they might have slightly different teachers they prefer, but they are all of one ilk. And also ISIS as well, that was caused so much havoc in Iraq and Syria. Another example. So yes, they're called Islamist, which means Islamic, but with a political agenda, and it's an agenda of dominance. Basically, what Hamas wants to do is to wipe out Israel and to take over. They want Jews to be under their feet, and part of the journey to establishing that would be to get rid of the Jewish presence in Israel and Palestine.
So we'll get to Hamas in just a moment because I want to talk to you specifically about that. But the recent conflict in Israel has exposed some deep ideological beliefs between Jews, Muslims, and even Christians. What would be your response to the statement that we all worship the same God?
That's a complex question, and you can answer it in different ways. I think the bottom line is, for me, that the God of the Quran has very different attributes from the God of the Bible.
Mm.
They both claim to live at the same address, the creator of the universe. But the Islamic God doesn't have attributes like faithfulness, love, holiness, presence, holy presence among his believers, not a personal God. So, there's this thing in theology that the concept you have of God drives everything else. People understand human beings in relationship to their theology of God. And I think the very deep differences between God's identity in the Bible and God's identity in the Quran project completely different views of what it means to be human. And they also project different societies. So the reason why Saudi Arabia is the way it is, and the reason why Australia is the way it is as a post-Christian society, the differences between us, has to do ultimately to different conceptions of God. So yeah, very different. Judaism and Christianity is a sort of branch that came out of Judaism. And so I think we share a common understanding of God, even though we would disagree with Jews over the Trinity and over Jesus and his deity. Nevertheless, I think we fundamentally have the same concept of who God is and what God's attributes are.
Mark, what does the Quran itself teach about the Jews? And how do you think this might motivate a movement such as Hamas?
Now, that's a really important and interesting question. And there have been some people, Bernard Lewis was one, the American scholar, who've said that Islamic anti-Semitism is imported from Europe. It's basically Christian anti-Semitism repurposed or recycled. I don't agree with that. The Quran is a thoroughly it's a hardwired anti-Semitic document, and the hatred of the Jews arises in the story of Muhammad when in Medina, where he fled with his followers. He was trying to persuade the Jews that he was a messenger of God, and they rejected him. They argued with him. The Islamic tradition called them the men who talk too much or something like that, or argued too much. So they rejected him, and then he rejected them, and a whole lot of very negative attributes are described in the Quran about Jews. It's said that they are rejected by God and they're under his wrath. In fact, the first chapter of the Quran, called Al-Fatiha, is recited as part of every Muslim's daily prayers. And one of the lines in that prayer is, lead me on the straight path, not the path of those who are under the wrath of God. And Muhammad explained that those that are under the wrath of God are the Jews. So every Muslim, in a way, several times a day, prays not to be a Jew who God hates. Really, that's pretty deep. And the Quran also says that Jews break their treaties. You can't rely on them. They're treacherous. They change the word of God. They're cowardly. They only want life. They're not willing to die for anything. It also says they're unjust. They are the greatest enemies of Islam always. It also says they're warmongering. They start wars wherever they can and cause corruption and trouble, and they're losers. So it's very difficult if you just think about it. If you're believing that the Jews are aggressive starters of wars, but they're cowardly people who are unable to fight for anything, then you have no basis for peace. The first one says you can't trust them anyway, and the second one says you have to win because they just want to live. They don't want to fight. They will never sacrifice their lives for anything. So, and you might think, well, that's just the Quran. It was 1400 years ago. Surely people today can make up their own minds about what they see in Israel. But the remarkable thing, in a way, I'm constantly shocked by it, is that when you read the comments of Muslim politicians and preachers and leaders coming out of the Middle East, and they're documented all the time, what you see again and again and again is that when these people comment on the Jews, they take these attributes out of the Quran and they say all Jews today are like this. It's as if a judgment that was made about a particular group of people, like the Swedes, say 1400 years ago, becomes the permanent description, the permanent characterization of that nation. And so the Jews are always in the idea of Muslims, of many Muslims. The Jews are always locked into these very almost subhuman. The Quran says that Allah changed them into apes and pigs. This dehumanized, inferior, aggressive, untrustworthy, and these attributes are clearly taught in the mosques. People learn that this is what Jews are like. And so again and again, you'll see them coming forward, and that just stokes the war. This is a huge driver of the conflict because it undermines the Palestinian Muslims' capacity to trust. It makes them make it very much in their interests, according to their thinking, to perpetuate warfare because they are totally convinced they will win against these evil. They have to win, and they will, because these evil Jews are not willing to fight and not able to fight properly. So, and they'll say things like, look, this is supposedly one of the most powerful armies in the world. They've got nuclear weapons. They still haven't defeated us. So they'll say, the fact that Israel hasn't killed us all is a proof of their cowardice and their weakness. And, that's just the problem with that is that the war just goes on and on.
Yeah, you've put together a series of 3 excellent lectures just recently. And I guess you'd call this series, Is God Finished with the Jews? And it's an excellent overview of Israel from a biblical as well as modern political and even Islamic perspective. A lot of politicians have made a distinguishing or a sharp distinction between Hamas and Palestine. Do you think that's a fair distinction to make?
Yes, I think it is, and I think it's a distinction we have to make. The problem is, if you were to give the Palestinians a free vote, eventually they'd re-elect Hamas. The reason why that is not because they want war, and many of them don't. Many of them are tired of it. But it's because Islam colonizes their politics. And the party that's the most hardline religious ends up winning, especially when they're feeling oppressed and downtrodden. Gives them hope. So, I think the only option for Israel is to thoroughly defeat Hamas and wipe it out and try to install a different kind of administration amongst the Palestinians in Gaza. But that's going to be very difficult because whoever that is, they'll be like a client of Israel, and therefore distrusted and rejected by the community. So it's very difficult. So I think the problem is Hamas is authentically Islamic in its agenda, and that is inherently aiming towards winning a war and killing the Jews, and that will always be compelling, especially for people that feels downtrodden. But having said it's difficult to separate them, I think we have to say, Hamas, I mean, people have been chanting free Palestine, but what does that mean? A Palestine run by Hamas? Is that going to be free?
No, good
And
point.
no, it won't be. It'll be like living in an ISIS. It's like living in an ISIS-run state. This is not freedom. So I think the Palestinians need something better than Hamas, and I hope that that will eventuate. But I think it's a difficult road ahead.
Yeah, there's a couple of dimensions to this, and you do make a very excellent point. What does free Palestine actually lead to? What kind of caliphate would it actually install? But I guess there's two aspects I want to talk to you about. Why haven't any of the surrounding Arab nations accepted Palestinian refugees? But also, that's the first part. And then the second part, I want to drill down more about, well, what is an Islamic understanding of the land of Palestine? Would they see their right of ownership of the land as preceding the Jews?
Yeah, so there's two questions there. In the past century, there have been extraordinarily large refugee movements of people. For example, more than 10 million Germans were expelled from Eastern Europe after Second World War. Um, and similarly, large numbers were exchanged between India and Pakistan at the time of partition. And there have been many other exchanges as well. And um, what has not happened in all those contexts, except for Palestine, is a decision by the nations to keep the refugees in a permanently in refugee camps. So, for example, if the Germans had decided to put all the Eastern European Germans in refugee camps on the borders of Poland and Czechoslovakia, waiting for the right of return, holding the keys to their houses, in lands where their ancestors had lived for 500 years or more, if they'd done that, Europe would be a basket case by now, you know. And so what's happened with the Palestinians is that a deliberate decision was made by the surrounding nations not to accept them, not to resettle them, not to give them citizenship. The only exception to that is Jordan. And it's partly because Jordan actually, at one point, conquered the West Bank and took it. And so the East Bank, and part of the West Bank as well, I think, as well. Sorry, they were always on the East Bank, but they conquered part of the West Bank. That's right. And so they granted Jordanian citizenship to those people. And later, many Palestinians have become Jordanian citizens through that time. But Jordan's not doing that anymore since 1970. So the problem is the surrounding nations will not accept Palestinian refugees. They don't see any responsibility for caring for fellow Arabs who are refugees because of war. Wars that the surrounding countries started and they lost when they attacked Israel in 1948. So the surrounding countries caused this refugee problem to a significant degree, but they will not take responsibility for it. In fact, they regard the Palestinians as a security threat in many ways for themselves. So that is a really at the heart of this issue. That normally when there are refugees due to people starting a war and losing the war, is that people find homes for them and the world tries to absorb them and that you kind of live with the new realities. But the surrounding Arab nations said, no, you will be permanently refugees, you will be permanently stateless until Israel is destroyed. We're not willing to fight Israel, but you can be our shock troops to oppose the presence of a Jewish state on what we think is of as Islamic territory.
Yeah.
So that's unconscionable and it's cruel.
I mean, it's a really good point
Um,
that you make, and it's overlooked so much in our media. Um, I, as you say it, it makes so much sense, and it is a great insight. I just there's this I guess sentimental, emotional part of me that would say I don't understand the irrationality of not if you're a Muslim nation not accepting Muslim refugees. Why wouldn't they have compassion on people of their own religion? Do you think? Does it serve their purpose?
I I think they have enough trouble managing their own security is one issue. I mean, when the PLO was in Jordan in the late 60s, sorry, they tried to assassinate the king of Jordan a number of times, and there was terrorism attacks against Jordan. So there's that issue. Another is I think Arab solidarity is a kind of they talk about it, but actually there's a lot of conflict between and tensions between Arabs. So it's a kind of fair weather solidarity. And in the end, there is this religious impetus. This should be Muslim. It's disgraceful to us that the Jews are there. There's a bigger backdrop for this, and the bigger backdrop is, for centuries, Islam was, after many centuries of victory, for centuries Islam was pushed back by the Western powers, by the Europeans, particularly, and Americans too, in the Philippines, for example. So that caused a crisis of faith for the Muslim world, and their crisis was, the Quran says we should be winners, but we're losing on all fronts. What's the problem? And the answer to that was more Islam, more Sharia, more Islamic revival, Al Qaeda, the Muslim Brotherhood. And this is the program. They're trying to make that successful. So far, they haven't been successful. The radical states that they've established, those movements have established, has failed. But the biggest kind of blot in the world, in the middle of this theological trauma about not being dominant in the world, the biggest kind of blot in the face of all that is the existence of Israel, of a Jewish state. These Jews that the Quran dislikes more than any other people group, right in the heart of the Middle East, and so it's an affront to them. It's a shame. It's shameful for them, and they want to eradicate that shame. So that's why the Muslim nations around are not taking steps that make for peace, basically, and the UN is not taking steps that makes for peace either, by continuing to support a refugee mentality, multi-generational refugee communities. You asked a question earlier, which I think it's important to note, that Hamas in its constitution made a statement that land once conquered for Islam is forever Muslims. And
Right.
so by this rationale, because Palestine, or Israel, Judea, was conquered back in the 7th century by Arab armies and occupied, and then Islamicized and Arabized, therefore this land belongs forever to Muslims. And so, and it's a duty upon all Muslims all around the world to rise up and defend it from the infidels who've taken over. And by this logic, Spain needs to be liberated, and India as well, so that the battle wouldn't stop with Israel. But that ideology, the idea that Muslims replace other peoples, they are not replaced. The replacement only goes one way. The conquest only goes one way. So that's a theological objection to the very existence of Israel. And, sadly, I think in the end, Hamas's strategy, which in a way many Muslims are sympathetic towards, is a genocidal one, which is, let's wipe the Jews out and take over from them. And victory's just around the corner anyway. That's their view.
You make a really fascinating point there, and I want to come back to this because it's a very important point about replacement theology. Many Christians like N.T. Wright would say that the church has replaced Israel, but in a very real and literal sense, Islam would say that they have replaced Israel, and not just Israel, but Christian nations as well. But before I get to that, and we talk about some Christian responses, can I ask you the question? Somebody posed this to me the other day. Actually, they're a missionary that has served in Islamic countries, and I thought it was a really insightful question. I wonder how you'd answer this. In Genesis 12, the covenant with Abraham, God says that he will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. Now, the question, and it's a very provocative one, is if a nation, an Islamic nation, for instance, is cursing the nation of Israel, does that put themselves under a curse from God?
I have an Iranian friend, and every Friday he and the other young men in his town would be required to attend the mosque, and they would have mass cursing the Jews sessions that go on for hours, cursing the Jews. And he actually, out of that experience, because he disliked the government so much, he developed a great love for the Jews. He said, these must be lovely people if our government hates them so much. Anyway, he's quite a character. He's a lovely guy. I think that's true. I think Muslims have cursed the Jews to their peril. Actually, Islam is not a very successful model. Everywhere where Muslims and non-Muslims live side by side with similar cultures apart from the religion, Muslims do worse. So in India, Muslims are generally quite poor. Serbians are more successful and wealthier than the Muslim Bosnians, for example. And the Christian Croats do better than the Bosnians too. And you'll see this again and again. And Christians often do well if they're allowed to in Islamic context, because they value education, they have connections internationally, they value trade. Islam tends to cause backwardness. And someone once said the whole of the GDP of the Middle East, apart from Israel and oil, is less than Finland's. So there's been no success story in the Middle East like South Korea or Hong Kong or Singapore, even though they have the vast markets of Europe before them. Those countries have not been able to have a technological revolution. They've been unable to kind of come, to move forward. They're many of them are very dependent on aid in different ways, and the oil money kind of disguises that. But so Islamic societies are pretty damaged. And I mean, Jesus said, if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And I mean, it's tragic, but there's been incredible carnage, not only against Christians, but also in the Middle East, also against Muslims. So, yeah, I think it's, I think about those words from Genesis, and I think Islam could be an example. It's tough for them because they think that Islam's glorious. They think that their history is amazing and fantastic. But in fact, what happened is that when Islam conquered a society, most of the Middle East was Christian. When Islam conquered societies, sometimes they would have a flowering for a while on the kind of spoils of war. Then eventually there'd be a slowing down and a loss of momentum and a decline. And that's happened again and again, unfortunately. So yeah, it's actually really sad to think about the damage that Islam's caused in so many cultures.
Mark, Christians themselves have differing views on the future of the Jews in the purposes of God. Can you briefly outline what some of those views are and which one is the most consistent, in your opinion, with the Bible?
The fundamental question I think that Christians have to wrestle with is, has the church replaced Israel?
Hmm.
That is, do the Jews have any theological significance at all? And there are some Christians who embrace replacement theology that say, yes, that's right. Jews they're no more significant than the Apaches or any group, because the church is the new Israel. And if you read the Old Testament, there's all these promises about the Jews: return to the land, the kingdom of God, the righteousness of God revealed, all these things. That's all for the church. It's all about Christ and the church, which has a very Gentile character these days, has had for thousands of years. So that's one view. It's called supersessionism, supersede. That is, the church has superseded Israel. Israel's done. The other view is no, God's promises to the Jews are still holding, and in a way, Paul's writings in Romans reflect that. The promises of God to Israel are irrevocable, he said. God still has a plan. He speaks about a hardening of their hearts in relationship to Jesus as the Messiah, but he says that the promises are still valid. And in my reading, when I read the Old Testament, I find it very hard to see that all those promises have all been fulfilled in the church. It doesn't actually make sense in many cases. And many of those promises are actually about the physical return of the people, because part of the promise of God, going back to Genesis, was a people, but also a land. They're not separated. And I just don't see how that's fulfilled in the church. So I don't like replacement theology. I mean, sometimes people don't technically hold it, but they act and speak as if it was true. It's like a practical atheist. You sort of believe in God, but you live as if he didn't exist. And some Christians, they don't believe God has rejected the Jews, but they live as if he did. But no, I believe that God has still got his hand on the Jews, that he's protected them despite events like the Holocaust. that his favor is still on them in various ways. And the fact that they have survived, I mean, where are the Philistines now? They've gone. What about all the other ancient peoples? Just so many of them have disappeared. The Jews are still around, despite everyone's attempt to kill them off. And not only are they around, but they're thriving. They're generating huge numbers of Nobel Prize winners. They're sources of incredible creativity. They've served the world in just by sharing their knowledge and expertise to the blessings of many, many people. So I must admit, I do see that as the hand of God, and for good. So I think it's very dire for Muslims to buy into this anti-Jewish hatred. Some people who believe in God's promises to Jews still applying have very elaborate end time scenarios. The Jews will return, then Christ will return, and the Jews will become believers. And there's dispensationalist premillennial views. That's a secondary issue for me. That is, your view of eschatology, there are different views, is secondary to the primary issue, is has God finished with the Jews? And the answer for me is obviously not. And I don't think that makes any sense at all. And I think if you read the Bible and you read God's incredible love for the Jews, which is just written on every page, despite all that they do at times that makes him angry, his incredible love for the Jews, to say that God has sort of said, "Oh, I've had enough now. I'm washing my hands of them. They're finished with," doesn't make sense. Like it's like what Moses said to God when God said, "Moses, just stand apart and I'll wipe them all out and I'll make a new nation out of you." And Moses says, "Well, what would the Egyptians think, God, if you did that? You caused them so much trouble trying to rescue them, and then you kill them off in the desert, And it's a bit like that, like God has shown his love and expressed his love for those people. I don't think God loves everyone else any less. God loves all that he's made and all the people in the earth. And those Palestinian people he loves deeply as well. He cares about their suffering as well. It's not a competitive grace or favor that I'm speaking about, but I do believe in God's enduring love for the people of Israel, and that it's not been wiped out because of the rising of a Gentile church.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I found your argument to be really compelling and confirmed, I think, something that I'd really come to some clarity on myself, that God is not finished with the Jews, that we are still to see a turning of the Jews to Christ. Maybe if I could ask you some somewhat rapid fire exegetical questions, because it would raise a lot of questions for people. You've already said that doesn't mean you're committed to a premillennial dispensationalist view. But if I could just drill down on what does that mean then? Romans 11, Paul says, "And so all Israel will be saved." Does that mean that in the future every single Jew will see in heaven, or only those that have turned to faith in Christ?
That's a really good question that I don't completely know the answer to. I believe in God's faithfulness to those that keep his covenant. I find that one hard to answer. I'm not willing to say every Jew who's a practicing lover of God and faithful to God is somehow excluded from the Messiah. But I do believe that there will be a great turning of Jews to follow the Messiah. I mean, otherwise, if Jesus is not the Messiah for the Jews, he's nobody's Messiah. So I do believe in that. I think what Paul was saying there was not that every single Jew under the rabbinical understanding would be saved. Actually, I think he's saying that the nation as a whole will be saved.
Okay.
Actually, whatever my interpretation is, I think he's saying is that God has a plan for the whole nation.
So you see it in a corporate sense rather than just in individuals.
I think so. I think he's thinking corporately. That whole passage is about how does God think about the nation of Israel.
Yeah, I mean, the other verse or passage that immediately comes to mind is Romans 10, where Paul is expressing his heartfelt desire that they would be saved, but they sought to create a righteousness of their own and not submit
Yes.
to the righteousness that is in Christ. Your response to that passage?
Well, I think That's right, and Paul speaks of that as a hardening of their hearts, and that is a rejection of the Son of God, which is very costly. Yeah, and that's a sad thing, and Paul's grieved about it. And I mean, I gladly would call Jews to follow Jesus and know Him as their Messiah. That is my
It
view.
seems to be part of the apostolic strategy and mission. And would you say is part of actually showing love to the Jews is to present Christ to them as their Messiah, which we have been engrafted into?
Yes, I believe that's right. And one of the big challenges that comes out of that is what then to do with Judaism. Has that been wiped out? So, the church's solution to that is that when someone becomes a Christian, whether they're a Catholic or a Presbyterian or an Anglican or whatever, the traditional approach was they're no longer a Jew. They abandon their Judaism. So then you're left with the paradox that God's not finished with the Jews, but the only continuing presence of the Jews are the ones that have rejected the Messiah. So in a way, that doesn't make sense. Now, in the first century or two, the boundaries between Judaism and Christianity were much more permeable. So even in John Chrysostom's day, Christians were going to the synagogue to listen to sermons, to be taught, and there was much more interconnection. The ways didn't part for centuries, actually, in many ways. So actually, I think there's a place for Messianic Judaism. There's a place for a community of Jewish believers who follow Jesus, Yeshua HaMashiach, they would say, and are orthodox in their faith in Christ, in terms of what the scriptures teach, but maintain a Jewish identity. And there's lots of things about a Christian identity that are not particularly Jewish at all, and that have developed over centuries that are not even essential. Like Christmas is not essential. It's great. I love Christmas, but Paul didn't celebrate Christmas, and so I think that some kind of Messianic Judaism is for me, the only logical solution to this. That why shouldn't there be a believing presence of people who identify as Jews and believe that we're all one in Christ? It's not a desire to put barriers between people. So it's for that reason that I'm a supporter of the idea of Messianic Judaism. They are Christians, to be quite frank. The label shouldn't confuse that, but they practice a faith that is shaped by kind of Jewish sense of identity and purpose as well. These are deep waters and challenging topics.
Yeah, they are. And look, I think what's really important and what I find so refreshing about your lectures is so much of the secular media just isn't familiar with sacred texts, that whether it be the Bible or whether it be the Quran. And so to actually drill down and to look at what the Quran teaches is really important. And to have discussions like this where we can say, okay, what do we think about this passage of the Old Testament or this passage of the New Testament is really important. So let me model that. Let me give you an Old Testament exegetical example question and then a New Testament. The Old Testament, in Isaiah, it talks about, there's going to come a day when, the person that dies of 100 will be considered a young man, no longer will they be accursed that way. Do you see that is a future millennial type arrangement, or what's the time frame in which you see that fulfilled?
Oh, gee, I'm not sure I'm the best person to ask about these questions. I mean, the future that the Book of Revelation predicts is one that is a healed world, a whole new world. And to me, that sounds like the new world. That sounds like the New Jerusalem, the place where there's no more tears, as the Book of Revelation says. Whether that will
that's really helpful.
Yeah, whether that will happen in this world, in this life, I have trouble understanding that.
Okay. Look, thank you for your honesty and humility. I mean, these are tricky passages. Let me go to, I think, the trickiest of them all, I think, is 2 Thessalonians 2, and the man of lawlessness who sets himself up in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God as the Antichrist. Now, my own Presbyterian denomination would see that the temple there metaphorically as the church, and has seen it in the Westminster Confession as the papacy. Others have seen it as a preterist in the first century view. John Stott still sees it as a future real historical person that sets himself up in a reconstituted temple. Your thoughts or opinion on this?
I think the idea that it's something set up in the church, so the papacy, is not looking at it through the eyes of Paul's eyes, or they wouldn't have thought that they weren't so supersessionist in their view of the relationship between the church and Israel. That's a later view. So that's not appealing to me. The preterist one could make sense. Like they might have been speaking about events that in a way were happening in terms of the persecution of Christians. But I'm with John Stott. I think the better sense is that this is a warning about despotic and incredibly destructive powers in the world that will both claim religious validity, but at the same time do extraordinary evil. And this is a scenario which the Book of Revelation addresses a number of times as well. I think doing false miracles and deceiving people. I think this is a warning of a combination of a kind of false spirituality and a hugely aggressive and destructive force. And I think we've been given these things as warnings that we live in a world where evil is not completely chained. That the devil is rampaging around, and things will get worse before they get better. So we shouldn't be surprised when evil rules. A year or two back, I reread the Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn, and it's an extraordinary account of the destruction of a nation. And I don't mean the millions who were destroyed in the gulags, but their torturers, the ordinary men and women, business people, soldiers, shopkeepers, who ended up torturing fellow Russians for decades. How did your neighbor end up doing this, crushing people's bodies? And that is a kind of an expression of evil that's taken over a whole society. And I think that those warnings, and doing it for the sake of righteousness, and they thought the official ideologies, they were kind of bringing in a utopia, and it was a false religion of communism in that case. So I think we should never underestimate the power of evil to take over forms of authority, such as religious authority, and whether that particular prophecy is referring to a specific event that that Paul had in mind, that God had shown to him in his visions and dreams that he had about the future, which not all of which he could share, or whether it's a general warning to the way the future which will unfold, which is one way to read the book of Revelation. This is a description of how we are to live in times of persecution and destruction. But yeah, I think Christians shouldn't be surprised at events like the Holocaust or the Gulag Archipelago, or even Hamas's attack on Israel, the slaughter of 1,400 people. This should never surprise us. We can be appalled by it, we can be shocked by it, reject it, and stand against it, but it shouldn't surprise us, because evil really is that bad. The world we live in is that compromised. This is really hard for Western people, because they've sort of bought into the idea that people are inherently good, and the best thing to do is to realize yourself, But I think we Christians have a different anthropology. We understand that evil is real, and that the bad in us is real too. And so these I feel stirred up to stand and speak against what's evil at this time. It's necessary, and it's not a time for just hiding your head and crawling into your cave and hoping everything will be well when you come out in the morning. This is not a good way to be thinking about the world.
So, Mark, God's not finished with the Jews. And but what should we expect then in the future in terms of do you think there'll be a reconstituted temple? Do you think that the Jewish nation will be before the Lord Jesus returns?
I don't know. I know that Israel
Mm,
today, although I support its existence, I know it's not a spiritually perfect state. You know, it's not the kingdom of God. And Israelis can be harsh and angry and vindictive sometimes. Although, if
mm.
they were even a part of as bad as what Hamas is, the Palestinians would really be in trouble. But um, I don't know what will happen with those things. I do see the rise of Messianic believers in Israel as incredibly significant. Um, they're a small, they're not a majority, of course, but they're a very vital group, and they're in some ways they're the healthiest Messianic Jewish communities in the world. I think are in Israel, and they have a boldness and a courage and a witness to Jesus as the Messiah within Israel. It's really significant. So that feels, in terms of the flow of history, the march of history, the emergence of that movement in the heart of Israel seems very significant to me, and I don't know what will happen, with it in the future. As for the temple,
Okay,
I can't, I can't predict that, and I don't. It's not necessary in my understanding of the end times to have a particular view about the physical temple.
sure. No, appreciate your honesty in just sharing what you really think. Maybe one final question, and that is, as Christians, I feel like we're really stuck in the middle here between Jews on the one hand, Palestinians on the other. What should be our Christian response, our duty before God in relating to Jew and Palestinian or Jew and Muslim?
The people that are really stuck are the Christians, the Palestinian Christians, and they're surviving by
Mm.
basically supporting the Islamic strategy and attacking Israel's validity. But that can't be. That's a response of a captive and defeated people, and we can't do that. I think we need to speak up for truth, and we need to do it in love. I have compassion for the Palestinians. My heart grieves for them. I think they've been brutally treated by their own leaders. They've been shelled and bombed by the Israelis. They've been rejected by other Arabs. They're in it's very difficult for them. I feel compassion and concern for Israel too. They are literally fighting for their lives. That's really they're fighting. What happened on October the 7th was a down payment. Hamas was saying, "This is the lesson we're going to teach you, and this is what it looks like. So you'd better be afraid." And so they are. There are Jewish young men that are going back, and women too, that are going back to Israel now to fight. And they know that they might die, and they're willing to do that. And I, I we have to feel concerned for them. I don't think it's right to pretend that there's some two-state solution around the corner, and that all that needs to happen is that the Israelis kind of lay down their arms and peace will reign. This is just a complete fantasy. Um, Israelis are fighting for their lives. Iran is mobilizing its supporters in Lebanon, in Syria, and Iraq. It's not impossible there'll be a full-on attack again on Israel as there was in 1948, and it could be incredibly destructive. Iran is seeking and has been seeking for years to develop a nuclear bomb, and they've said many times they'll use it on Israel. So these are not this is not about what to do with the Palestinians. This is also about whether Israel will at all survive. And in terms of what's just and right, in terms of this battle, I support the Israelis. I think they're fighting for their freedom. They're fighting to live. Um, Someone, I think, recently said that if Hamas laid down their weapons, peace would break out. But if Israel laid down their weapons, they'd be slaughtered. So that's the difference between the two sides and what we're really facing here. So I think Israel has to win this battle. I think it's enormous casualties will come. It's really tragic. It's not something they've wanted to do. So that's where I'm at. We should maintain compassion for both sides. One of the most distressing things about this, when you look at it around the world, is that people will either be completely one-sided or completely the other. People will be lamenting about Palestinian casualties but have nothing to say about Jewish casualties, and vice versa sometimes. I think as Christians we need to be concerned for everybody and have compassion for everyone and to advocate for everyone as well. But at the same time, I think there is a more righteous cause in this battle. There is a just war that Israel has to fight in order to live.
Yeah, you make a number. Sorry, you go.
The Palestinians, in basing their views of the Jews on the Quran and not on their lived experience, have made a terrible mistake. They believe the Jews will not fight, and they will lay down their arms and run, turn their backs and run, that they're weak. This is not true. And having gone through the Holocaust and more than a million or so fled from Islamic countries too, as well, at the founding of Israel, they know what they're fighting for. They know more than Australians do. They know that they're fighting for the survival of themselves and their wives and their husbands and their children and their children's children's children. And so they have no choice but to try to survive. That's crystal clear for them.
Yeah, and you make a really excellent point that this could very much spill over into conflict involving other nations, not the least of which is the US. I mean, I know this is a political or geopolitical question, but do you think there's a likelihood of this becoming a more significant intercontinental conflict?
Well, the US is involved. They have military bases in the Middle East, and some of them have been attacked in the last few days. So that's perhaps one reason why they brought some aircraft carriers in. They'll also be supporting Israel with trying to put up rocket shields and so on, I think. So yeah, they'll get drawn in, but there's no obvious kind of opponent of a similar order of power. The Iranians are serious enemies and highly technically capable, and they're very. The Iranian economy has been damaged by all these boycotts because of their desire to make nuclear weapons, but they're a highly capable nation. So yeah, I can't see Russia or China being drawn in, or other players like that. Turkey, I think, will keep to itself. It has its own agendas to run. So yeah, I'm not a geopolitical expert. So America is more likely to be drawn in by the possibility of attacks on its own soil. So the Hamas has called for Muslims everywhere to rise up and basically attack Jews and also their allies, which includes America. So that would be a really bad scenario for America, is if there was another 9/11 or some sort of huge attack on their soil. So that's their security services will be on high alert, and that'll be true across Europe as well.
And I think with what's happened recently in Sydney at the Opera House with the Palestinian or pro-Palestinian protests, I wonder, God forbid, that there might be a terrorist attack, Hamas inspired, in Australia. What sort of impact would that have? Do you think that would draw Australia more into the conflict?
I think there will be more attacks, yes. And what that demonstration showed is that there are men who agree with Hamas and think that what they did was right. And once you're in that position, then if you think somebody else going and killing and raping children and old people and families and so on, burning them, then that's distressing. That's dangerous for us. So there's no question about that. What's happened is a veil has been pulled back. I think Hamas called on all its supporters to get out on the streets, and they did, and we've seen them. So we say, yes, we note that you're here. And so I think Islam's been off the agenda for quite a while. Radical Islam. We've been worried about COVID and China, and or whatever, American decline, Ukraine, Russia. But it's now back. It's a reminder that this war, this jihad, is not going away, and it won't go away. It'll be with us all the century ahead. Should the Lord tarry, it's um, it's back in a way, and it never went away. So we'll see. I think the security services need to be watching our safety within our borders. We'll see how Australia responds. I think at present the Labor Party has got significant numbers of people who are pro-Palestinian. Albanese won't want to go too far. He does support Israel at this point, but he's already kind of backpedaling in a way. So I think we're going to be sitting on the fence a little bit. What happens in the longer term, I'm not sure. It depends on other events. Depends on what happens in Australia. Depends on the way our political parties go as well.
Mm. And it's one thing we can absolutely agree on is that Christ is Lord over all of this. Like the book of Revelation shows, he's the one that breaks the seals. He's the one that releases, I think the rider on the white horse, which I think is false messiahs or false Christ, but everything's under his sovereign hand. And as such, how should the church, do you think, be praying specifically at this time?
You just cut out there for a second.
Sorry. I was just saying, Christ being sovereign over all, how should the church specifically be praying at this time? What does it mean that God's will be done?
I really believe in the prayer that the prayer of the saints is effective in reaching the throne of God. We should be seeking the kingdom to advance in every possible way, which includes the proclamation of the gospel to those in distress and in difficult circumstances. We should be having compassion for Christians in the Middle East. Wherever there's war in the Middle East, Christians suffer enormously. And they are often neglected. The aid agencies are dominated often by Muslims who don't sympathise with Christian refugees on the ground. I mean, in the countries. So I think Christians across Australia should be paying attention at this time to what's happening with Christians in the Middle East and doing what they can to support them. I can't emphasize that enough. This is a really we're thinking Israel, Hamas, Palestinians, Jews, but actually Christians in Iraq and Syria, in Lebanon, they will be hurt badly if war breaks out. And it's good for us to be paying attention to them. I think we need to pray for truth to prevail, that we are in a crisis of truth in our culture. Postmodernism has undermined people's confidence in truth. And this is a war that is about truth. And so I think we need a kind of courage in our nation to speak the truth. And that's something I think Christians can and should contribute to. The other thing is we are going through a civilizational cultural decline in the West. We're losing our way. And this is a really deep thing. And people's sense of what it is to be human has become corrupted. A sense of what it means to live a good life has become secularized. And we need our teachers, our churches to rise up and declare a vibrant, positive vision of a Christian worldview and how to hold to a biblical view of what it means to be human in the midst of a society that's increasingly hostile to those beliefs. So that's a really core part of whatever we do in relation to Israel and the Middle East. We need to actually deal with our own backyard as well in terms of holding our ground and holding faith.
Well, Dr. Mark Durie, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you again and so enriching to be able to hear your insights. If you'd like to read more of Mark's works, including his excellent book, I just want to raise it again, The Third Choice, but there's also a number of other books that Mark has produced on the relationship between Islam, Christianity, Judaism. You can find it at markdurie.com. Mark, thank you so much for joining us, and it's been a wonderful blessing. Every blessing to you, brother, and your ministry going forward.
Thank you so much. It's been a joy to talk with you about these very important things.
Well, this has been Mark Powell for AP's Profiles in Christian Living, and I hope you found this more recent episode as enriching as I have, and I look forward to seeing you next time.